Hey everyone, welcome back to the Satisfied Philosophy. Today I'm going to be discussing the difference between the start of Hegel's ontology and Schelling's ontology. So, Schelling and Hegel, or Hegel and Schelling, are two German idealist thinkers who wrote around the early to mid 19th century. Schelling did write a little bit towards what we might say like the maybe like the mid. Schelling wrote in the 40s and the 30s. Hegel died around the 20s, 28, I believe, and so he only wrote from we'll say like 1801 to like 1828. So, but a lot of people know about Hegel, but not a lot of people know about Schelling, and I think that this is a bit of a travesty because I think Schelling's German idealist interpretation is his continuance of the German idealist tradition, interpretation of Kant, and his very, very erudite engagement with ancient philosophy goes undiscussed. And I think we kind of focus on Hegel, and we should say, what if there is a better German idealist thinker than Hegel? And I think that in some ways, Schelling perhaps gets to some points of German idealism that Hegel simply never got to. But I'm going to be discussing Schelling's lectures on the philosophy of revelation. These lectures were done in 1841 to 1842. So I'm going to be largely discussing his start of his ontology. A lot of people familiar with Hegel know that Hegel begins his ontology, whether you look at the Science of Logic or you look at the Encyclopedia of Logic, two very important texts in Hegel's corpus. He begins his ontology with the idea of pure being. So Hegel says, suppose that we could think of pure being. Pure being would necessarily be equal to pure nothing because pure being would have no determinations, nothing would, it would have no attributes, it would just be pure being. So he goes, well, if you immediately think of pure being, you're thinking of nothing. But then he goes, wait a second, what if we can't even think pure being? What if pure being is this unthought reality that we can't get to? And because when we try and think of pure being, we always think of a being, right? We always think of a being. So let's say that I'm trying to think of pure being. I might say, well, when I hear the words pure being, I think of like a black circle, right? But a black circle is a something, it's a being, it's not being itself, it's not pure being. So that's what Hegel starts with. He says, well, when we try and think pure being, we automatically are forced by our cognitive limitations to posit a something. And then Hegel takes this and goes, well, let's keep positing some things. And then, well, okay, if this something is positive, then there must be that which is not posited. And that which is not posited is in some sense posited to give us the something, because you have to have a negation and a negation to get a determination, to get a something. But that's all later down the line in Hegel's ontology. The idea is just that Hegel begins with pure being. So Schelling, writing after Hegel in 1841, Hegel died in 1828 or around the late 1820s, he says, yeah, Hegel's right. Like, it seems that we have to begin with pure being because what can be thought more like first? Like, what can be thought more primary than pure being? But then he goes, but Hegel thinks of pure being in a wrong way. So what Schelling does here is very fascinating because he was, I would argue, much more familiar with ancient philosophy than Hegel was. I mean, Schelling read Greek. Hegel didn't read much Greek. So Schelling read these ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, Plotinus, Porphyry, so on, and he read Latin. And so he was able to engage with these thinkers in a way that Hegel wasn't. So what Schelling said is, Hegel begins with pure being and says that it must become something and it's equal to nothing. But Schelling goes, why? There's a presupposition here that pure being is actus purus, is pure act. What if we say that pure being isn't pure act, but pure potentia? This is a very different start to ontology than Hegel. Again, Hegel says pure being is pure act, actus purus. Schelling goes, why don't we say that it's pure potentia? Well, thinking about being as pure potentia means that being doesn't necessarily pass over. It means that being can remain being. But what Schelling does here, and I will try and quote what he does here because I think it's very fascinating, is that he says that there is, even in this case, a movement, a passing over. Because if you just have pure being, even if it's pure potentia, that pure being must necessarily pass over. But he still says, I'm going a step further than Hegel. Hegel's saying pure being passes over, but I'm going, no. Pure being is pure potentia, but pure potentia must pass over into pure being, and then perhaps Hegel's system can follow. But what Schelling says here is that it's not that there's a negation of a negation which creates something, as in Hegel's system, right? Schelling says that the passing over, I'm actually going to read the quote. I like the quote a lot. The passing over must happen in a becoming other, but this is not in the sense of becoming a quotative being, only a quitative being. So what Schelling does here, and these are two scholastic terms, quitative and quotative, and quotative is a being that exists in the world, right? So a quotative, it's sort of it's the thatness, okay? That exists, the thatness of something. Schelling says that with pure being, we can only get to quitative being. Quitative being is the whatness of something. So he goes, what Hegel does here is he takes this weird step where he says, pure being, we get a something determination, but then Hegel goes, let's make the jump from pure thought to nature. And Schelling goes, whoa, there's a misstep here. How did Hegel get from actus purus, pure being, to nature? Schelling goes, we're remaining in thought. There is no thatness of being possible to get to in thought. We can only get to the whatness of being. And Schelling says that the whatness of being is that being is in its most blind form pure existence. It's that pure being, that pure potentia. So then Schelling kind of goes on a bit with Aristotle, and I think that he used Aristotle in a very intelligent way here. He draws on Aristotle's idea of the prime mover, the thought that thinks itself. And if you're familiar with Hegel, you know that Hegel, at the end of his Phenomenology of Spirit, 1805, he says that absolute knowing is the thought thinking itself, right? But what Schelling says, whether he doesn't mention Hegel's absolute knowing in this context, but he says that, well, thought thinking itself, he doesn't mention even Hegel's name here, but it's in the chapter on Hegel. He says that, well, a lot of people misunderstand what this means because it's not a motivating force, an effective cause in the Aristotelian language. It is a final cause. So thought thinking itself does not motivate anything to exist outside of itself. It simply is itself thinking. So what this means is that when Hegel says that we can try and we can get from our interior thoughts to nature on a pure understanding of absolute knowing of thought thinking itself, Schelling goes, whoa. Hegel is misunderstanding the final cause for an effective cause, or rather, Hegel might say that it is both a final and effective cause. If you know Hegel's idea of the absolute is that it's always already present at the start of the system, but you must realize it retroactively. So I have a whole video on the science of logic where I explain it in 15 minutes. I will link that in the description, or I will try to put it in the video on the side so you can watch that if you're confused, because I can't go through that right now. But Hegel would say that the absolute is always already present at the beginning. So Schelling goes, well, there seems to be an issue here. We have said that we have mistaken the final cause for both the effective and final cause. And he says, that's not in Aristotle. That's simply not in Aristotle. Aristotle critiques that idea where he says that Plato's idea of participation, where Plato talks about the realm of the forms and finite things participating in the eternal forms, Aristotle says that's all like hogwash. That's rubbish. It's vague. It doesn't make sense. So What Hegel seems to try and do here is apply a Platonist gloss to Aristotelian understanding of the prime mover in his idea of absolute knowing. What Schelling goes is, let's deal with Aristotle. Let's put aside Plato. Some may say that Schelling's early writings kind of had this sort of Platonic bend to it, but I would certainly say that in his later writings, Schelling is certainly an Aristotelian. Aristotelian Spinozist, probably, if I were to classify him. He wouldn't call himself that because he was an original thinker, as every philosopher thinks they're an original thinker, but I think that's a good way to classify him. But so Schelling would say that we need to deal with Aristotle here. We're dealing with thought thinking itself, which is for him pure being, pure potentia. So the question then becomes, pure potentia, how do we get from our inner thoughts to the nature? How do we posit nature? Well, he explicitly critiques Hegel's idea that the absolute can other itself and create nature, where Hegel says at the end of The Science of Logic, let's see if I can find that just right off the bat. Yeah, Hegel says that logic can determine itself to become nature, but there's sort of this obvious question that Schelling says is, it's like, well, how does logic determine anything? It's not like a conscious agent. He says, did Hegel understand idea as existing in actuality? Obviously, a mere concept cannot make a decision. So how does the idea in its infinite freedom empty itself? Using the words of, in emptying. Intelassik, how does it empty itself? Intelassik, and it can't. So Schelling's dealing with Hegel where he's like, there's this weird anthropomorphism in Hegel's understanding of the idea, that the idea can, become nature and it's emptying itself. But how? Schelling's like, we're still dealing with thoughts here. We're not dealing with anything substantial. We're not dealing with, again, that term, the thatness. We're dealing with the whatness of being. So what we might want to say to Schelling, and I think that now I'm going to kind of move away from both Hegel and Schelling and apply that Orthodox framework, patristic, a Neoplatonic understanding of ontology, is we might want to say to both Hegel and Schelling, there is no need to draw this sharp distinction between that which can be thought and that which corresponds to nature. Because if you already understand nature as itself fundamentally mind, that is to say that our mind is itself a participation in God's mind, and nature is the foundation of nature is also participation in God's mind, then the idea is not that we have to posit this becoming otherness to somehow get to nature. Nature's already there. Nature's already there, and we're in nature, and nature's already there because there's this fundamental union between our mind and nature. Because nature, materiality, does not exist on its own in itself, on seek in itself. Nature is always in union with spirit. It's always in union with mind, because nature is fundamentally mind. So that's kind of where I want to depart from both Hegel and Schelling, is that both of them are wrong. We don't have to say that there is Schelling's critiquing Hegel because he goes, Hegel can't get to nature. Schelling admits he never gets to nature. He's stuck with the mind of inner thoughts. And he says that that's the big problem, and why the German idealist project must go on. But it's like, well, the true idealism is a proper patristic orthodox understanding of reality, right? Where everything participates in God because everything is fundamentally mind, and there is no sharp distinction between nature and material, because materiality is, perhaps it's a bit of a vague concept, but we might say that materiality is the manifested form of mind. It's the highest manifestation that mind can take. And thus, when the higher form of mind, a higher form of reality, imposes itself as the formal cause shaping that lower form of reality, a very Aristotelian language to maintain the Schellingian point here, that there isn't this new thing being created in this material world. It's just a maximization, a manifestation of the mind, of the spirit, of the nous, of the chi, of the Tao, whatever spiritual term, religious term you want to use it. that fundamental thing underlying material reality is participating in the mind of God. So I think that's how we can correct both Schelling and Hegel. Schelling doesn't get past the mind. He's unable to. He's stuck in post-Kantianism. In some ways, he gets past post-Kantianism, but not fully. Hegel can't posit nature because you can't get from the mind to nature unless you already presuppose that there is a unity. But presupposing that unity means that God must exist. What creates that unity? Because if okay, let's say that there is this is known as the psychophysical argument in contemporary analytic philosophy, but it's kind of a basic intuition that has been known by all ancient thinkers, Indian, Christian, Jewish, Hellenistic, Platonist. It's that you can't get from in our minds to reality unless there's already a presupposed unity. And that's where God must be involved, because God must be that which is the total unity and the final one, and the total unity that ensures that that interconnectivity, that correspondence, that perfect correspondence between nature, reality, and mind, spirit. So that's where both Hegel and Schelling go wrong, and where that orthodox understanding shows that philosophy has to be overcome with divine revelation. Now, Schelling's whole book is on the philosophy of revelation, but for Schelling, revelation is sort of this like metaphoric, the revelation of Christ for Schelling is like a metaphor that has a deeper meaning in philosophy, but this is just making that same mistake Hegel made. It's the mistake that revelation is something lesser than philosophy, lesser than earthly wisdom, or as St. James says in his letter, epigeis wisdom. No, we are dealing with heavenly wisdom. We are dealing with wisdom from the heavens. We might say, Sophia Tonoranos, right? Wisdom of the heavens. Wisdom from the heavens, baby. Sophia Kataranos. We're dealing with heavenly wisdom. We're not dealing with epigeis wisdom, earthly wisdom. Wisdom from the earth, Sophia ton tigiis, right? We're not dealing with that. We're dealing with heavenly wisdom. And I think that that's where the Schellingian and the Hegelian system go wrong, is that they can't deal with that idea that revelation imposes itself upon our finite minds and shows that all finitude is itself a participation in the infinite, but in such a way, not in the Hegelian sense where the infinite is immanentized, to say that our world is the infinite in the material sense, but that the infinite is outside of our world, but that our world in a incomplete fashion participates in the infinite. So, with all that extraneously said, I'm going to double back and say Schelling and Hegel and German idealism in general cannot get past the problem of how does spirit or mind or nous posit the external world? What is that correspondence, that linking point? We aren't dualists. If you're a dualist, you're wrong. Dualism is a priori wrong because it posits a duality, and any duality is not sufficient for thinking ultimate reality. It's just simply not. There's no argument need to be made against dualism than that. I mean, there are good arguments to be made, but that itself is just sort of a priori true. So the question then becomes, if it's not dualism, is it monism? There's two types of monism. There's materialism and there's spiritualism, where you can say there's Platonic monism, and then there's a materialist monism, a Spinozist monism. And those are the two types of monisms, and those are the only plausible philosophical systems. And I think that Spinozist monism and materialism has its own problems, many problems. So obviously Platonic monism, the Neoplatonic understanding, the Indian understanding, the patristic Christian understanding of ultimate reality must be true. And that is where I stake my claim, and that is where I end this video for today. So, we were all over the place, but I'm tired of reviewing things on my channel and having to, explain things I've already explained into other videos. So, if you're confused, watch my channel, because everything I've talked about in here I've said before, other than maybe some of the stuff idea of the formal reality imposing itself on material reality. a higher form opposing itself on a lower form. That is new information. That's why I explained it more. But when it comes to the ideas of Hegel, I'm not explaining those in any more detail because you can watch my videos, all right? 15 minutes, Science of Logic explained. It's not perfect, but it's 15 minutes. It's not hard to watch, and you'll get the basic ideas to engage with Hegel's ontology in general. And Schelling's ontology, first time I've covered that because this is the first book I've read by Schelling, frankly. So it was really good to read that, kind of compare the two, and then see just the dominance, the preponderance of a need for a Christian understanding, a Neoplatonic understanding, an Orthodox understanding of that relation between spirit and nature. So with that said, subscribe to the channel. I'd like to do more of these types of videos where I go through philosophy, secular philosophy, and be like, that's wrong. This is how Christianity solves it. So, I think that that would be cool. Of course, I think that secular philosophy has so many problems that you have to have that Christian revelation. You have to have that Christian preponderance to spiritual being and all of that to solve any basic problem in philosophy. So yeah, thank you guys. Like the video, subscribe. Have a nice day.